Hello everyone, today we talk about strategy and logistics in the Age of Enlightenment. As you know, from a couple of years I started this sort of slightly more in-depth but still generic sort of introduction to essentially from 16th to 18th century Western warfare. And I already also discussed in other dedicated and more in-depth videos for my series about modern warfare in general, from the older cycle that is still of course there. The part of the issues we will looking at today, strategy, I talked about, say, generally speaking, one of the 30 Years' War. Just recently we talked about Montecuccoli. We talked from a theoretical point of view, we talked about the same logistics. We talked about cartography in the 17th century. We talk about the influence of technology on logistics, for example, from the 16th century. So there's plenty, if you check out my modern warfare playlist, of course, of references, aside from specific wars and tactics as well, that today we will not discuss, if not just en passant, for the obvious reason that if you talk strategy and warfare and logistics, you also have to explain how that passed through tactics. But again, going step by step as this, laying these basic stones and then moving on them is, I think, always important for reconnecting with what we already discussed and with what we will see in the future. So as we have already seen, the Age of Enlightenment is characterized by an important effort to rationalized management and logistics, right? In part, it could seem, a prejudicial observation, because, of course, the Enlightenment is thought to have injected further sort of rationalism and scientific insight, mathematical, physical, technical, technological, say innovations, right, improvements, and more, right? Of course, warfare is always about rationalizing, because it's contrary to the culturalist myth that it's a thing that just barbarians or animals do. It's actually the single most rationalized choice that goes against actually the most the lowest form of instinct of survival. And as we know from the Clausewitzian Trinity, actually is waged as a political act by that first person that embodies the most rational element of a people, right? So I often talk culture again, but I'm staunchly and notoriously, if you also look back through my historian playlist, culturalism, right? It's not that war depends passively on cultures, and cultures do not change, because this is literally what the new military history, Keegan said, literally try to make people that, of course, never opened, just like Keegan, once in their life, the Frauenkriege actually think war is, and expressing even a moral judgment on war, as if war per se was a problem, right? Not, just an instrument of resolution that can be a good or bad idea in potential compared to the actual practice. Most of the times a bad idea, right? It's at least the quickest, right? It's not necessarily always something that you should consider as the, say, most likely resolution means, but sometimes it is actually a very positive thing to make war. But I say this because, of course, there is a universal dimension of war that is inherent in the, say, in humanity, in the world, in just the way we cognitively make sense of the world from the first beginning conflictually, which is also the reason why studying war, learning war, also finding war is actually the most effective way of making sense of reality, and and there is, let's say, in a sense, unfortunately, always a chance to do so. But at the same time, that chance is still describing to you what reality is, and why such terrifying thing happens. So definitely not the daily bread of the masses that think that war is just something that makes them have less money at the end of the month. Not even saying seeing their houses bombarded, but just saying we don't want war in general. But of course we will not understand anything of why it is fought. We'll just even take sides based on some sort of pseudo-moralism, even though we don't know absolutely anything, nor about the history, the politics, the culture of the countries involved whatsoever. Right? And this is, of course, for the masses, absolutely always the case. There is not a historical exception, right? Not understanding war always shows the degree of the cultural inferiority of a people. And this is valid also for whichever side. There is not the side that, about the political issue that says, this group is actually right because they understand the thing. No, to be right, no, they don't, right? Even the right side, 90%, or just to be extremely generous, that supported idea do not understand anything about that and do not have any merit whatsoever. Actually, they're bringing down the entire thing because they're too dumb to actually understand it. So there is nothing to be proud of to be part of the mass whatsoever. The only purpose of mankind is elevating yourself to God and nothing else, right? And this is why the entire traditional history revolves around holy war, because that's objectively the only way to achieve that in the first place. And today, okay, we will not talk about this philosophy of history and war and politics, but always bear in mind that the language that is used to describe war, to look at it historically, because there is also no other way, even when you actually participate into a war, in a war or another, is heavily influenced, it's heavily biased by this kind of simplification. The Age of Enlightenment would be described to you in this sort of rationalistic and rationalizing fashion, whereas all wars, right, in all historical time were about this, right? In the way they were waged, because you cannot really unsee the problems that you have while doing so. Now, we've already highlighted in other videos the main characteristics, say, of 17th, 18th, 19th century armies. Today we will approach that for the sake of didactical clarity, but what you should know, at least if you follow the channel, what we're talking about, so I won't be repeating myself excessively about them. Essentially, in the 17th century, the armies, once they were put on the field, were largely left to themselves as far as supplies were concerned, and essentially lived at the expense of the country. This had always been the case, and it's very interesting to point out. I mean, by different degrees, there were always supply trains, chains, infrastructures were, in a sense, was made always on such preconditions. But of course, there was also a large component of it that was still, well, okay, if we can supply ourselves along the way, and the army will function like this, and maybe we have some specific reason for doing so, because say we want just to loot the territory that we invade, and or in fact maybe when we defend instead, the population would just support us locally, etc. Well, we can make war, because the point being, even if there had been somebody else that could supply an army more, right, in quantitative and even maybe in qualitative terms, the cost-benefit ratio would have not necessarily been productive in that sense. In other words, it was easier, say, to have these armies just starting, right, to go, and the time that you would save by doing that was much more important than how, through the means of the time, you could supply another army to counter this one, and losing, in fact, maybe territory in the process, right? So it was never about, say, those before were primitives that were not able to wage war. There is always a good enough so that everything looks always unsatisfactory in many ways, but the objective is the one that politics is pursuing by waging this war, and so everything is bent to that practically. In the 18th century, instead, have this idea that the government had to try, at least to plan, in an organized way, supplies for the troops. Again, this was true also before, right? A great part of the reason why states exist is also that they are effective at making war over other systems. And again, the need to provide specific pieces of equipment that were necessary during a prolonged war effort that exceeded, again, from literally what the guy could bring from home, and something that you find from antiquity, even from prehistory, to some degree. So the reason why, in relative terms, we say, well, look, from the 17th to the 18th century, there is this passage, is because, of course, there was a dramatic acceleration that was the greatest, both in relative and in absolute terms, that warfare had ever witnessed, especially actually since from the half of the 17th, right, but taking shape, of course, gradually, and had that brought the armies just to be more, right. The armies on campaign were more and more numerous, and also more demanding, right, as we will see now, so that they would have hardly have been able to maintain themselves for long without a minimum of logistical organization. Now, it may seem strange to you that literally up to some time in the army of the Sun King, nobody had literally ever done something like, okay, let's plan how many supplies, talking about properly food, ammo, clothing, etc., will be needed for this army to stay on the field, right? That literally nobody had ever made that calculation. Why? Again, because they could find this stuff largely in loco, and it would have been just somehow more effective, right, to proceed in that fashion rather than stockpiling all the resources that you may have needed at that point from some supplies, some warehouses, etc. Naturally, both things kept existing, right? But the degree by which this was the case was changing significantly. Today, we do not enter in the details, also the statistical dimension of how more numerous and the armies and the troops on campaign really were. But I think you have a good idea if you look at the War of Spanish Succession. That was this massive peak, in fact, even in absolute terms of soldiers fielded by either France or the wars of coalition, essentially, that were fought to check her hegemonic role on the continent, and that were proven, by the way, to be so costly in broader terms that after the War of Spanish Succession itself, armies began to decrease in size, right? And there, throughout the 17th century, you have specifically a qualitative increase, that is to say, smaller armies that naturally were still growing together with the colonial empires, with, of course, the same European demographics, but that were ever better equipped, better armed, better supplied, rather than just say, let's inject lots of people in, as it had been, say, at the time of the wars of the Sun King, where literally the fact that, again, France had achieved that level of political cohesion would simply allow, in fact, her to send all those troops in, was neglecting, as essentially the largest military powers normally do, at least in a military culture, also like the one in Europe, so pertaining also one of the enemies that is largely homogeneous, largely symmetrical by approximation. In fact, quantity over quality, right? That's the actual point. It's like, I don't know, look at the U.S. armed forces today. It's not that America doesn't have actually the top technologies available. Of course, it wouldn't make any strategic sense to pretend to, for the American armed forces overall, considering their size, to have the same level of technological achievement of, say, the Belgian or the Australian army, right? So this is the point even at the time. And so what we're looking at, as you understand, is also dramatic imbalances in the sort of basic level of state building, right? Because it's difficult to make comparisons with today, because today there are actually much greater gaps, but they're not much qualitative, rather as quantitative per se, and the fact that still there is, for example, a different way of, for example, a different quality of life in general. So you cannot have the same quantities involved between, say, major powers and others, merely on the basis of, on size. Just think about, I don't know, how much more costly the life of an American is compared to the one of a Russian, right? You can easily see on campaign, right? There is a radical cultural gap, right, and massive sort of moral divide between the two systems, for the obvious reasons that, of course, one is disproportionately more powerful than the other. And now we cannot just simply descend even in there, and the historical process. It would be interesting. I can make contemporary warfare videos as well. It would be very interesting, and I will, right, time allowing, we will surely expand way more in contemporary warfare. But this was just to give you a basic idea. So the need of a minimum logistical organization was ever more obvious, considering that we're literally armies of hundreds of thousands of men, right? Something that, again, had not been even feasible in the past, right? If not with, say, massive, say, look at, I don't know, the Roman civil wars, where Rome was already huge, but, these armies were still, based on ancient standards, of some sort of very local basis, affordability. There was a lower growth rate. Everything was not radically different, actually, from even the 18th century, right? But here the Industrial Revolution is kicking in, so we're looking at definitely at least the last stage of a civilization, in fact, a pre-industrial civilizational development. In any case, this is also interesting, by the way, because I often make this point also in my videos about late medieval warfare and the early modern one, that, of course, the military revolution, this sort of farce that we have been imposed for the mentally feeble, has completely obscured the fact that while this alleged revolution that literally took half of a millennium, right, for passing from the introduction of firearm technology to essentially a musketry, a fire, decisivity in a way, right? So from pikes to muskets in a way. So the magnitude and all radical, explosive, escalating change that actually occurred was at the very, after the very end of this alleged revolution. It is in fact with the armies of the Sand King that, if what happened before was a revolution, what was this, right? And of course you understand even there, just from a, why historiography, let's say at least how limited historiography is, and you can even easily guess the reasons why they're so blind and or just wanted to create a sort of an alternative reality just to satisfy their own made-up paradigms. But never mind that. The increasingly decisive importance of firearms brought definitely to much greater supply needs, because there was, of course, an increased consumption of ammo, and especially gunpowder, right? The latter being much more precious than the former, much more difficultly replenishable, and in any case, that had to, even when gathered, sent to the army. So essentially, armies began to be ever more connected to the supply lines, to their mostly country of origin or bases around the world, and campaigns were strategically affected by this, because as you have learned studying, the 7 Years' War, by that point you have the peak of that. The ultimate point was just to outflank the enemy, to sever this line, and so literally sometimes not even needing to fight a battle, because the enemy army would have disintegrated without that constant supply. The birth of an organized administration, that is, a set of services directly managed and financed by the state with the aim of guaranteeing the supply of the army, responded to various needs, and primarily political ones. Think about the rising importance of the public opinion that actually was always there too. It's not an 18th century invention. The printing press was already there. The effect, like whatever communities think, is always there. Bureaucracy had always been there. I mean, the 18th century, of course, sees an expansion of this, a consolidation of this, and a sort of, in a way that is relatable still to today, because we're talking about a few hundred years ago, and essentially it's at that point that the physiognomy of the states that we know is mostly recognizable. At least it's the one that by scale resembles, but at least by form, what we have today. And I'm not, of course, going to digress on this either. But public opinion was important, if anything, for one reason, that the Third Estate was gaining, as you know, much greater importance. Right. After all, the Ancien regime had allowed these countries to prosper, to expand dramatically, and of course this had happened also in messy ways. And the Third Estate, that was the most, say, the one that had flourished the most within the system, wanted to take control, to manage the same reason what there was a French Revolution, etc. The Fourth Estate actually had nothing to do with that, because Fourth Estaters have not the palest idea of what anything is, right? They're just brutal, blind, stupid force that you can manipulate for your own interest, nothing else, and rightly in a justified way, because that's how relation between humans must work. But in the sense, it's obvious that war, as such, and there was a bit of also the germs of populism in a way, or of some, say, elements that did not look, as I was saying at the beginning, at the actual effectiveness that a war could have. We're ever more worried that, let's say, chaos and devastation would come back in an indiscriminate form, like it had as it had been seen in the actual horrors of the 30 Years' War, right? Indiscriminate violence against civilians, for example, was the norm in prior times, also because, in fact, up to this point, there had not really ever been a difference between a military man and a civilian, right? The context, the concept is extremely new, and it's also hypocritical to some degree, telling the truth. But the point was not much about the thing in itself, because collateral damage at least is always there. And of course, there are instances, plenty of in history, when civilians were just massacred on purpose, in non-military operations, fundamentally, also in much more targeted fashion. If not, you want to still consider, of course, that in fact that's what doesn't make sense, right? Violence is violence. There's no such thing like a military violence or civilian violence separated by degree. It's just that, of course, especially in Europe, where we are so ever more enmassed, and people are growing. Look, the demographics is increasing dramatically, etc. It's obvious that wars, as it would all be seen tragically in the following centuries, the World Wars, but also the Napoleonic Wars, of course, were incredibly closer, right? For millennia, wars had been fought mostly with a sort of, continental relevance, because you could have, say, armies with a regional base waging war somewhere else, but still in a confined fashion. Think about the Crusades, or even, feudal wars, some were very contained. The Wars of the Roses, for example, were just essentially noblemen killing one another. There weren't even devastations in the countryside. That was an exception, of course, but this would have been unthinkable in the 18th century. Now, instead, whatever happened in Europe risked to engulf the entire continent, right? And this had already been happening. We think of the 7 Years' War as the sort of First World War, which technically may have not even been the first one in that regard. But, say, think of Europe as a whole. That, of course, had been shown in some of the most violent conflicts from quite a while. And generally speaking, it wasn't much the fact that war would, say, because, say, wars had always been fought to a significant degree, and also relatively to the crop rate of the population, the demographic growth rate, the life expectancy had always been even heavier in the past, right? But they were at this point concentrating an unprecedented amount of force locally, right? So that entire communities could technically be wiped out. And this was becoming ever more shocking, also thanks to the media, right? To the fact that, just like today, there is a big deal about a war about, wiping out 20,000 militiamen. Well, this has enormous repercussions, because also psychological reasons fueled by the media. So a bit like the, and talking about in real economy, right? So it was starting to be a bit like that at the time. Without any doubt, these wars were terrifying for everyone involved. So at least it was, as you know, the beginning of some sort of regulating and civilizing, let's say, wars to reduce the impact on social life. And needless to say, the ideal was only partially realized, because you cannot avoid that, really. And the arrival of enemy troops definitely did continue to represent a nightmare for the populations, and especially in the countryside, accompanied by violence and requisitions, because, again, still, armies required a dramatic amount of local support to operate, right? They weren't literally depending exclusively or by the majority just on the actual supplies that arrived from the warehouses back home, right? There was also technically a capacity of operating further, right? There were armies, think about I don't know, the Swedish one during the 30 Years' War, that were literally, they were actually working through an impressive logistical system that Gustavus Adolphus had planned dramatically, and we've seen it in the video about the strategy of the 30 Years' War. The Catholic strategy was exactly to try to invade northern Germany, while Gustavus was invading the south, paradoxically, because he could have brought things to a much swifter end. So, again, very complex, but there was, as we will see now, this problem also of how far armies could go. There was, also, of course, a toughening of the various strata realities that made up Europe, so that you wouldn't find, in spite of this dramatic military development, even that kind of overwhelming disparity that existed in the Napoleonic era, where literally one country could take over the entire system, as France did. But you have, and this speaks of the homogeneity of the continent during the 18th century. Nevertheless, there is still some margin to that, which of course the main powers could always threaten there to literally now play on a much bigger strategic field, had they simply managed to crush an enemy state and use that for supporting their own army. So this was what was paving the way to the Napoleonic Wars. However, compared to the previous age, when this, the usual outcome of even the passage of friendly troops would bring to devastations of unspeakable proportions, Germany losing literally 1/3 of its population, and unsurprisingly giving rise to that specific sort of new political institutional system that would characterize the country henceforth. There's based on a sort of more independent reliance of individual states on their own resources for maintaining a unity of command to avoid this sort of even guerrilla raids, depredations. There's no doubt, in fact, that also in the 18th century, significant restrictions reduced the impact of war on civil society. This new philosophy that was naturally accompanied by the works, the literature of some of the most famous, at least, minds of their times, that, however, were like 18th century philosophy is all contained in 17th century one, telling the truth, and even more by ancient thinking. It's nothing revolutionary, or, if anything, what happened during the 18th century is that sort of proto-nationalistic and proto-socialistic ideologies were starting to loom this system, but at least influenced decisively the way of waging war through the introduction of the concept of warehouse, and instead is something, in fact, entailing more the need of a centralized state and some sort of permanence of more readily identifiable structures and authorities and so on. Before starting a campaign, it was no longer enough to gather an army and to take it into the field. It was also necessary to accumulate vast supplies of food, weapons, and ammo. The strategic capacity of an army increasingly depending on the proximity of the aforementioned warehouses in which the supplies were kept, and on the possibility of periodically distributing them to the troops, using slow and cumbersome convoys of wagons requiring robust supplies to avoid any dangers from the enemy. So, again, initially very rudimentary and primitive system, but still, this is the first time it fundamentally was established to the scale that had never been seen before, to the scale of hundreds of thousands of men, again with an for armies of an increasing specific weight, as far as probably also the irreplaceable elements would maintain. For example, certain types of horses, of artillery, right? Those are things you cannot quite simply get from the local country per se. At least it's never going to be of the effectiveness, of the quality, of the extent that these warehouses in your own country can provide you with. And this, interestingly enough, if you remember what happened during Napoleonic Wars, that instead abandoned supply trains altogether, paradoxically, even if the armies were even much larger and sort of far-reaching than before, still you couldn't do without war horses, artillery. Those had still to be sent from the state. I presume if you've been following me for from a while, you know why Napoleonic armies took that direction, because they were so big that at that point it would have become even more expensive to supply them from a country, and so they started to leave off the land again, except they were again so big and much bigger than even those armies that were not simply possible to feed on the land, that they had to radically and extremely expand their strategic range. They had to be on the move all the freaking time, and so also giving rise to much more decisive operations compared before. And again, it's what we were saying just now about the expansion of the military capacity in general, the force that was invested, and that of course was the product of the nation state, of the fact that everybody now was a citizen, but also forced into war without distinction, and so, but also always reflecting the increasing moral and material force that, of course, the West had, in spite of the ideology that could kick in compared to before, diluting gradually what tradition had been about, but still being quite effective. And again, I made multiple videos to explain also how the ancien regime reacted, for example, to the Jacobin Napoleonic system, because at the end of the day, even after France was put at bay within the boundaries of her historical state, even with the restoration, fundamentally you have a hybrid with Napoleonic system, even in the most reactionary countries. And of course, we still live in that system, right, in Europe today, from this point of view. So it goes without saying that the less enterprising generals often took advantage of this reliance on warehouses to avoid taking on too many responsibilities. They could blame their sacrifices on the difficulties of supply until someone began to think that the dependence on the depots was too heavy, a constraint, and it was necessary to try to free oneself from it. Which was right. Again, this is how 18th century art of war would develop like. This is what essentially the Napoleonic age would have brought on the fore, but mostly even the French Revolution before Napoleon. And for that, we have already discussed at length, and we will surely come back on the topic. I think there is an equivalent video that I made about the Napoleonic era and this strategy and strategical and logistical topic, and so today it's just the chapter before, we can say. So in general, in the Enlightenment era, the planning of a campaign depended on the position of the warehouses and the safety of the convoys, in a sense, much more than on the intrinsic mobility of the troops, right? Which evidently contributed to a certain static nature of the operations. So it is true that you have essentially a bigger punch, but from the other side, you have another punch. War is an act of politics primarily based on moral forces that reciprocally influence each other. And this, of course, is to limit by the laws of reciprocity. If you have an enemy that is fundamentally your equivalent, because again, 18th century Europe, except some parts of, say, of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, but gradually, like it's essentially the same as far as the system goes, will provide that also internal resistance to this. And if you interpret this from a 19th century perspective, of course, it seems like an asphycted system, for the simple reason that the 18th century is not really the Age of Enlightenment at least in the most radical sense of it. It's actually the apotheosis of monarchic regimes that were surely, by improving the power of their countries, however eroding the same ancient regime. And again, this is a very important topic we shall see sometimes, but still in the 18th century, essentially warfare was seen as an aristocratic sport. Still, society worked like on different communities of countries that were essentially the same one, worked in the same one of the Middle Ages, right? Kids today see, just because their nation somehow rose in relevance just in the last couple of 100 years, like, it was us. And reasoning with a 19th century nationalistic, socialistic ideology that was completely unknown and especially despised by the very people that commanded the system and who achieved so much in the previous century, right? Of course, the absolute sovereigns that were never quite fully absolute, right? Only the nation state became an absolute state. But of course, they deeply felt a deep contempt towards their own national peasantry. Right? There was nothing about that national prevalence that mattered. The thing that was more important was the traditional superiority of the dynastic elite, that of course was macroscopically more responsible and capable and, say, competent in ruling than the mass, that however was growing and was in the sense becoming ever more dangerous and threatening those traditional beliefs that would eventually be seen, shattered, to say the least, in the Age of Revolution, to eventually just bring them, there is always a good side and a bad side of modernity, and as I always say, modernity doesn't quite exist, and its good side is still its traditional values, and that can also inflate and deflate over time. There is not a linear decadence necessarily, and the bad side is just the denial of the same. But of course, like, it's not that the mass acquired, I'll say, the individual acquired more power in relative terms than it had in the previous centuries later, right? So there was a greater participation of the mass as such to political decision, but it still was very limited even after the revolutions. Just again, the richer and better educated people had this right extended, and frankly, I don't see anything wrong about that for obvious reasons. But obviously moral and scientific reasons. But aside from that, war was still seen as, I am a monarch that essentially is ruling on this people because God saw me fit for it, and the people support me because I'm here to respect the God-given law in general, and sort of vice versa, because of course there was a respect towards leadership, towards authority that goes, say, double thread. And so I will convince part of these communities that are heterogeneous to support my war of honor against other dynasties that rule in this way, and the ultimate purpose being me as a leader bringing these people to victory by redeeming their misery as inferior people through holy war, right? And this was absolutely and deeply ingrained. Again, this is not the first thing you think when you think about the 18th century, but if you actually just, walk through Versailles or any other 18th century, palace, of the nobility of the time, you understand that the entire theme of the mythological, the classical, the ancient was exclusively based on ancient mythology, the Roman Empire, and the sense of, sovereigns being essentially gods, right? At least less fallen gods than the rest of the people that had the purpose of bringing everything back together divinely. And this was the most obvious identity that exists at the time, that has been completely erased from your school books because you're a fourth estater and you had not to know what the entire history of the world was about until a couple of hundred years ago. Right? This is what nationalism and or socialism did for you, right? To make you an inferior being in the process. Now, the sense that, of course, there were lots of difficulties still to be overcome in 18th century Europe, even from an infrastructural point of view, how do you feel? Because the 18th century, even for powers like Austria or Prussia, was the first time in which they had fully, like, what we think like a modern army, right? You've seen it countless times, and this came through an enormous work, enormous friction, the poor state of the roads, for example, and above all, the absence of reliable cartography had a similar effect. I made a video exactly on cartography, military cartography, that explains to you a bit like how through cadastre, through just technological innovation with aerial views, think about air balloons. I mean, just even continental Europe was for the first time drawn in a more accurately scientific fashion, right? Because before, just mostly naval cartography, coastal cartography was the most effective. They would calculate the distance from the coast with chronometers using the speed of sound, this kind of things. But, the hinterland, Central Europe, there was also more, say, backwards than the West, for example. That is something where, when you realize the emergence of, think about the Silesian Wars, the 7 Years' War, the clashes between Austria and Prussia, that is the civilizational manifestation of the expansion of these powers in a reality that never existed to that degree. Right, it was incredibly complicated. Still in Napoleonic times, we've seen it in the War of the Third Coalition, for example. The actual myth that the Allies had different calendars, the Gregorian and the Julian, depending on from the Austrians, the Russians, so they had not synchronized their operations. Right, they thought of different days. It's actually a myth, in fact. But if that could cause a problem, had it been true, it would have been nothing in comparison to the state of the roads in Central and Eastern Europe, right? And of course, that caused so many issues, even just for knowing where literally the armies were, at how many days of distance they were. This was a huge problem that affected dramatically strategic plans as well. So communications were not that reliable. Things were improving, right? But there was still a lot of way to go. Just another aspect at a decisional level, right? Think of how today major military powers decide politically and strategically how to wage war. But you can still find major flows, right? Look at the invasion of Ukraine. It's literally unbelievable to think the least. But generally speaking, how much there is, at least in theory, in terms of, just look at the strategic analysts, just look at the various branches, like how the military works in the first place, the think tanks, the various experts, also external from the system. At that time, basically, generals were out there on their own, right? Let's leave aside the heads of state, and because, as we'll see now, it was also a big problem often not to have a king that would actually fight that would actually be in command of the army on campaign, right? That had been a precaution, rationally enough, because you couldn't risk a monarch in all the possible dynastic issues just because he had to show to be brave, etc. But until the previous century, that was actually something that was at least ideally required, right? In the 18th century it would happen as well, also later on, but the thing having separated fundamentally what the court was, what in fact the monarch decided, what the inside could be, and what the generals did on the field. There had been very diligent monarchs, such as the Sun King, that would write continuously, would keep in touch with the generals in the front, etc. But the point is that the generals at the time were not surrounded by a staff of specialized collaborators either, right? So they could not, even if they had seen it right strategically, for example, develop complex movement orders as it would happen from the time of Napoleon. Admittedly, this was also caused by the fact that armies, as we've seen, were not so wieldy. So they would have not needed much of a dramatic strategic sophistication to operate. Essentially, you had to identify an objective that, as we'll see now, was always still a fortress, or of course you could engage in open field like another army, but the entire concept still revolving, still like in the Middle Ages, around that kind of strategic objectives, and it was it, right? The thing was mostly to move this army as a single mass on a single main road, and this obviously made its movements even slower. The enormous quantity of vehicles carrying baggage and supplies, the slowness and bulk of the artillery convoys, the need to stop every few days to build field ovens and bake bread, right? Because that was the problem. You had every day to stop and to billet the troops, and that scattered across, say, some space. Then, of course, there were some broader cantonments, there were some field fortifications, camps, but everything was fairly slow, right? And again, it's not that these armies were actually slower if they had, let's say, in absolute terms, than, say, previous armies, because actually all armies would, in history, if you look at them, would be able to make 30 kilometers a day, right? If you look with the ancient world, the medieval one, the myth that was any change is ludicrous. I wrote specifically about this. Medieval armies constantly marched 30 kilometers a day, right? In the optimal status, yes, that's the truth, but say a status that was normal, 30 kilometers a day is what an army of even tens of thousands does, right? Unless there is an enemy in between, or they're stopping to besiege something, or there is some reason for which they decide to take it more easily, and sometimes we're even speedier, right? So in the 18th century, this is true as well, right? But they still preferred, because of maintaining their strategic stability on the idea that it was about mostly being that well supplied and sort of covering even your front in a way that the supply line wouldn't be threatened. That often brought the daily speed even to 10 or 15 kilometers. And you understand that if you look at wars like, I don't know, the ones fought in Flanders, right? So where you have literally at a few hundreds of kilometers of distance, France, the Spanish Netherlands, you have, in fact, the United Provinces, some German states, and the main strategic objectives that take, as we will see now, months to capture, just single fortresses. Well, you don't even need a speedy army, because in a few days you can get there safely. And the most important thing is that the army remains well supplied, well nourished. This is also for an actual tactical purpose, one of morale as well. So this was rather a sort of choice, right? Even in moments of terrible pressure. In spite of the much larger forces that could be fielded by a single state in the 18th century, the size of the single armies on campaign had, however, to be limited. We're talking a spatial problem here. these armies, as we've seen, needed still to be supplied, they were kept together through some hierarchy and general unity of control, of command, and that was yet to be developed, in fact, in the more unitary standardized forms. As we've seen, there wasn't even properly a staff. Armies were led by single noblemen, fundamentally, that were entrusted with specific tasks, and of course were under somebody else's command, and quite rigorously so, but that, as we've seen, were often left out on the road, right? An army that had to move along a single road, as we've seen, so with all the, and I made a video from the Von Kriege series that shows to you like the concrete limits again of the space of that armies can cross, right, without starving to death fundamentally and or exhausting the useful resources for the same army, burdening the resources of a limited area with all its horses, for example, could hardly exceed 40,000 or 50,000 men. Consider that in the past, say up to, in fact, the previous century, 50,000 men was, in terms of, especially of tactical control, under a single commander on the battlefield, were considered a bit like a miracle, right, to manage effectively. So this was not really, again, the change was important, really big, but it was still gradual. We still met with the difficulties, as we've seen, of even commanding these troops effectively, because, say, tactical, for example, combined arms operation were becoming ever more dynamic, ever more counting on, of course, a standardization even here that is taking place, but in this sense also all a set of, say, complicacies that made it initially still difficult to have functionally more men under your command and being effectively employed. Only in the richest country in Europe, Flanders, where all the resources of larger coalitions were concentrated, that's not, say, a coincidence, definitely. Louis XIV and his enemies managed to field armies of 80,000 or even 100,000 men. Again, enormous. Nobody had ever really seen anything like this. We're looking, again, mostly at the peak of with the War of Spanish Succession, and also the previous, say, wars in the late 17th century had displayed this dramatic growth. It is true that each state maintained a much larger number of soldiers under arms in times of war, up to 400,000. The case of the Sun King, especially. But of course, the vast majority actually of these forces were employed in the countless garrisons or in various small armies operating on separate theaters, while governments and war councils attempted to coordinate their objectives and movements at a distance, which is, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, France had, again, this dramatic political control on an enormous amount of people and agricultural resources and more, for historical reasons that now, again, we will not digress on. And so, as we were saying before, it had brought on the battlefield on campaign quantitatively the largest amount of men possible. But of course, all these soldiers, if you study even just the political history of France under Louis XIV, were a deterrent, right? There was always a sort of risk of revolution. There was always some. This is true for basically any country at the time, comparatively to the political and social balance, but concretely, right? Also, as we've seen, armies were fundamentally all alike at this point. So, generally speaking, these numbers corresponded to the size of the land in proportion, let's say, of the country in proportion. And of course, you needed lots of these troops stationed somewhere, which still means a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of control, a lot of, say, gradual passage from subcontracting to public statalization. And the various armies could even operate on a single front, except with the, again, limits, the excess of 80,000, 100,000 men, right? That rendered very often, again, these battles huge butchery that had actually its own strategic and tactical sense, right? The myth of the butchers, unfortunately, is yet another fourth estate or superstition under which most people live, unfortunately, still. And say, but of course there was still the risk, and that would bring, in fact, armies to be more often separated, that such enormous concentration of forces could be unsustainable on a given theater. And again, that was, as we've seen, Flanders, right? This could have not been done in Galicia, for example. So this was bringing, of course, states to operate also just in certain areas, and as we've seen, the same development of a country meant a lot in terms of the weight that it had in Europe politically, and so everything was proportioned to these various degrees of development. There was this increased need to connect the armies on the field to the political decision making at the moment, right? So an ever greater contribution, let's say, to the mills, or to the strategic decision making by ever more competent individuals that, of course, had been former commanders, etc., had to advise the king. But not only, it was also a matter of, say, again, cost, economically, etc., and all these enterprises were, again, as all war is, political actions, intrinsically. Another reason why, especially at the beginning of our period, between the 17th and the 18th centuries, the campaigns were slow and inconclusive, is that the strategic plans continued to be dominated by the role of strongholds and sieges. Right, there is an enormous literature on, for example, on the Sun King's Wars. I made a video about Louis XIV's army and warfare, and more specifically on the worth of that, on the cost of that. Right, it's just like what we see again, and that's where superstitions stem from. Looking at War the First, like, where was that bloodshed sort of? Say, it's not that it has to be justified, but it has to be at least motivated by some results at the end of the day, because you can also lose the war, right? So this is often a dichotomy that already escapes, in fact, the normal populistic judgment on these topics. I mean, the idea that those who lose are the weaker side, and this is something that must be explained also civilization. Like, why would you side, first of all, with somebody who lost in a sort of cultural sense, right? Why is that another country can win over another, right? Even if it were moved by the most evil ideology, still the fact that somebody lost to that is something upsetting, because it shows from the other side that it was not ready or effective, right? This can take different forms. Today we got to the point that people literally whine about people dying, and thinking that countries back in the day were sort of the political projection of fourth estate, fabricated historical, political, and cultural mythologies nowadays, so that you must root with the decision, for example, of your country not to have entered World War I, because deep inside all you want is that your system to be self-sabotaged, because you're a failure inside of it, and actually you're still one of the people that lives in the best lives in the world, thanks to your country, because you think that if the other country would have won, it would have given a fuck about you as a loser, right? This is the severe mental disease that we are witnessing ever more among the masses, right? The complete incoherence on any, again, moral, personal, and cultural basis regarding any scientific or moral understanding of history and war, especially. That is probably the single most misunderstood topic ever. Because it's very easy to make the punchline, oh, somebody died. Well, yes, and how did they die exactly? Because I don't know any state in the world that doesn't have a juridical system that at least asks how the person got killed or died, in order to determine whose responsibility is it, and it's always different, of course, case from case. Today, the pseudo-intellectually, in fact, unsophisticated people must pretend that, a person killed in a war is a person killed in a war, as if there was any moral equivalence between human beings. This is frankly very and severely disturbing, right? It shows you what it means to be an inferior people, and it automatically betrays your complete illiteracy in any kind of historical, political, or military notion whatsoever. But just in basic reality, I mean, these are things you can understand even from person to person. In your everyday life, it's not something that you really can't picture, or you don't actually act upon on a regular basis on their own. We should teach children very seriously from primary school that there is an abyss between speaking one's opinion and this opinion having sort of relevance whatsoever, right? These are two completely different things, right? Whereas today we think that every opinion is worth the same. It's absolutely not, right? And most of it's actually completely worthless, or negligibly so. So that while we treasure freedom of speech, first of all, you can't quite say everything you want. Freedom of speech doesn't mean that you can't be sanctioned for things you say. You can't go out there insulting a person just without no basis, right? And it's up to this person also whether to collect it or not in the first place. But that is for boosting a sense of, positivity in the person faculties, right? And in order to spur the actualization of the self. This has nothing to do with the failure of a person into that. Those are two completely different things. That's literally the difference between equality of opportunities and equality of outcome. They have absolutely nothing to do with one another, right? The fact that I give you a chance doesn't mean that you can't be a scumbag as a consequence of your actions. This is what must be taught forcefully, even with impositive, violent means all over the world, by states, by legal authority. And this is what we do, because technically you're forced to send your children to school and to learn certain things, except you're responsible for what is being taught or not. And you still have that political writing capacity to change that, right? And that's what this channel is also about. But going back to our topic, France, which was definitely at the center of all the major European wars during the long reign of Louis, was large enough to accommodate vast warehouses. We talk about, of course, the Sun King. Of course, France had a substantial stability also in the following, Louis XV, etc. But as we've explained in that video about the Sun King, that it's Louis XIV's France that really begins what we intend truly as, I would say, the modern state, right? I use the term modern warfare just to stick to the most conventional, say, periodization, right? By saying, okay, well, we accept that sometimes around the 15th, the 16th century, we start talking about modern warfare. But it is true that it's not until Louis XIV's times that the major step forward was carried out in the creation of an actually national army, right? So something was entirely under the control of the monarchy at least, and that was in fact established with some principles of standardization, right? Of let's say of fluidification in the availability of these forces, and in the pursuit of a truly hegemonic politics and strategy continentally. Now, the enormous, and so, again, even under Louis XIV time, by the way, you had the so-called Dragonnat troops still billeted among, say, in fact, in that case, the political enemies, the Huguenot Protestants, and however, at the same time, the affirmation, the establishment of barracks, warehouses. Again, it's not that these things had not truly ever existed before, because the same feudal world from which this system was evolving had de facto established courts, systems of fortification, training, whatever. This had always been there. But now it was about having the central control and the sort of, again, rationalization of the political and strategic control, first of all, on the country, and the same capacity of defense and offense internationally, right? And this was an immense work, and this is simply why Louis XIV's army was the strongest in Europe. The enormous number of strongholds, the limited mobility of the armies meant that the sieges still absorbed a large part of the military activity, and so you can see how most of the warehouses that were established had the function of serving siege warfare. All right, I made a video specifically on the staticization of 17th century warfare that explains how the thing had come about, but of course with Vauban, the system of the Trace Italienne had been surpassed after a couple of hundred years for the development of much bulkier, bigger, more sophisticated fortifications that, of course, were sort of swallowing the others in the process, because there were fewer but bigger, more strategically relevant. But overall, say, just by surface, let's say, of territory, could be covered effectively through such strongholds. That was all calculated, of course, on the basis of, so the army deterrence and so on. You would evidently see how many of these fortresses you needed to carry out an effective, to get the upper hand on the enemy. And fortresses were, say, still that important in warfare, but it's not that alone. They would simply ensure, even as a massive system of fortification supported by garrisons, etc., just a country not to be invaded, right? Or somebody to march on Paris. Actually, Louis XIV and his say, advisors and generals and armies succeeded, unlike Napoleon's and one of his marshals, say, in preventing the enemy from marching on their capital, right? But you can the main point being that these fortifications are effective as long as there is a field army that operates, right, to essentially to protect them, to come breaking the siege. And if this army gets defeated, then you can have so many fortresses garrisoned. But if you have an army at that point that can take them one by one, because there is not an effective force, say the enemy state collapses, and you can't quite put together a normal force. It's not just that you can literally enter the country, but this is simply melting away in terms of political cohesion, moral resistance, so that even the garrisons will evaporate. So it's never that, let's say, devoid of risk, right? This is true also for the Middle Ages, the fact that, again, castles were dramatically effective. They could hold large amounts of troops with much smaller numbers. Doesn't absolutely mean that there weren't, even in medieval times, major invasions and conquests just, at a regional level, just straight away, right? There are quite famous macroscopic examples of that. So the point being that doesn't matter how
effective a garrison was, first of all, it was not equating to a field army inside a fortress. That would have created enormous, in fact, logistical supply, let's say, even hygienic problems. And that was, in fact, the reason why these fortresses were conceived strategically, just to stop the enemy from simply passing through a certain territory, even if they had not blockaded effectively one road or one, say, passage in the first place. But simply because they could launch attacks to the supply lines of these armies, that, as we've seen, were at least to be supported from the motherland, let's say, in order to push forward. So everything revolved, as always, around the bigger armies. If these were not present, the entire fortifications would have melted away. It doesn't matter how sophisticated in engineering and insight, like technical insight they were. That's not what a fortress does, right? Strategy changes continuously, right? A fortress in itself doesn't have an intrinsic strategic value. It's what you do with your armored forces in function to it that makes it acquire one. So many decisive battles were fought to unblock besieged cities, such as Vienna in 1683. I made, as you know, lots of videos on the topic. Turin in 1706, when Prince Eugene, as you know, broke the French siege. A general like the Duke of Marlborough, considered one of the most enterprising of his time, also in sort of logistical capacities. He made some mistakes sometimes, but nevertheless, as a supporter of dynamic and aggressive strategic conduct, fought, in fact, in his career, only 4 major battles. Were already a huge deal for the time, for a single commander, while he conducted more than 30 sieges, and that gives you a bit the proportion of how frequent larger engagements really were. And this is not really different also in scale from, say, the Middle Ages. From my experience, one of the very few actually medievalists who studied in that, first of all, that is also a military historian, but studied in depth, in fact, the statistic dimension of every single operation, not just single battles, right? And you can understand the practical reasons, of course, knowing late 17th and early 18th century warfare. Why, right? These sieges, often inconclusive, with some armies that could simply sit there, maybe gain some other towns while the enemy was, besieging another, but always remaining in proximity. So eroding one another without forcing the action could actually bring to the thing. And you understand that if operations were so slow, in perspective, you can't even say, well, okay, we can maybe lose that fortress if we don't lose an entire army. And that does make sense in a way, except the force of entire armies that were deemed capable, of course, of crushing the enemy were just politically on the field, right? An inconclusive action was costly with the allies, with your own people, etc. So these were powers, by the way, that were operating at different times in different places, and so the same political debate revolved around different things going on at a time, say in America, in Europe, in different parts of the same. Excuse me, I drink a little. And so, as we've seen, a siege could not be handled in a few days, even if Vauban, the greatest military engineer of all times himself, who directed, in fact, 53 sieges in his own life, had transformed it to all intents and purposes into an exact science, considerably increasing the chances of the success of the two sides, right? The siege artillery with its 36 and 48 pound pieces and its immense mortars moved very slowly, right? So first of all, if you wanted to take a fortress, you had to load yourself with this massive pieces that really required enormous logistics. The construction of the siege lines under the direction of the engineers was always a tiring job that mobilized for weeks the soldiers and even civilian diggers forcibly recruited from the surrounding areas. And the commander of the fortresses made it a point of honor to resist as long as the circumstances, such as breaching defenses or the failure of a relief army to materialize, did not entitle them to negotiate surrender. In other words, and we've seen it even, say, in Napoleonic times, there was a sort of standard that could be calculated regarding the, say, average resistance of a stronghold under siege. Right? Everything was designed and standardized also in that regard in order to let, let's say, the world know, let's say, the system know how long orientatively these fortresses could hold out. Naturally, war is primarily, again, about moral forces. So you couldn't quite calculate with certainty how much a stronghold would hold. But given that there had been all this, and this lays in the nature of these powers again, there had been a lot in Europe going on regarding the sense that between gentlemen, war had to be fought in a certain way, that of course the commander of a garrison wasn't quite necessarily risking his own life, and for a reason that would not be understood by the general sense of loyalty to one's own country, especially when it was being, say, invaded in that regard. Things were much more messed up than they sound, but it's like, I don't know, just in Napoleonic times, you knew, at least, you had a bare minimum standard for which you knew that before a certain amount of hours, a division, doesn't matter by how many forces could be taken on, could not be worn out, it could not break. So on the basis of that time, you could make all the calculations that were necessary to sort of safeguard the situation. Doesn't matter how in practice the latter was emergential, and so how difficult it was to maintain a country at war and how much this all cost, etc. That is more important, and that's why it's messed up. At least from a military point of view, had some guarantees up to a certain point that you could handle a situation like that. On average, the siege of an important fortress lasted between 1 and 2 months, and since with the arrival of the bad season, the lack of forage, and the terrible state of the roads forced the operations to be suspended and the troops to be housed in winter quarters, it is understandable that the time and resources of an entire campaign were, say, often absorbed by a handful of sieges. You could reasonably expect what even the next year things would have looked like. And this, again, doesn't mean that this positional warfare was not absorbing the massive force of entire nations. The point being that you still could, let's say, stabilize the situation around these issues, and you could clarify also to the ever more involved international community, say, what was practically going on, also to receive more, and everything went in parallel, right? It's not sieges that did this for others, this for politics, for society. It's rather the other way around, right? The importance of the warehouses and strongholds combined with the great cost that the new standing armies represented for the state budget gave the war of this era one of its main characteristics, namely the fact of becoming a war of maneuver, that is fought by generals who prefer to avoid the risks of direct conflict as long as possible. Apparently so. This is the prejudice, at least, we have towards the 18th century. Surely, this is the picture. In the early part of the 18th century, you have this sort of more attritional type of warfare with almost a positional deadlock. Right? Look at the sieges of Flanders, all this kind of backs and forths in the same places, in the same theaters, and so on. Not only, right? Because strategy was always different in other places. It's like thinking that, I don't know, the Western Front in World War I, with the front stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland, wouldn't move just more than a few tens of kilometers, had anything to do with the technology of the time. It has nothing to do with that, virtually. It has to do with the fact that there were massive industrial powers and world, in fact, empires that were playing iron arm, right, on the front. It's like, I don't know what is happening in Ukraine right now, right? On other fronts, you had easily, with the same technology, maneuver, right? Way more dynamic warfare. So this is it's surprisingly one of the most difficult things for actual adults to understand, this simple concept that you have their enormous amount of forces concentrated, and it's not the tactical dimension that actually creates the thing. It's the entire thing behind that. It's not, technology is not even relevant, but it's just at the best the tip of the iceberg, right? It's not even ever approaching in any historical context more that 50% plus one by any stretch of the imagination. Maneuver began to be used again for other reasons. First of all, the change a bit of the international map. There were, especially with the War of Spanish Succession, lots of different, also the dynastic issues that were going on. Lots of territorial changes that, as you know, mixed the cards once again. And so, after the bloodshed of this war and sort of the mediocre results in terms of control of the largest armies, it was observed that it was better to have better supplied armies, to invest in more also in terms of equipment, of armament, etc., than larger forces. And also again, because the political international scenario allowed new fronts to be open, and often also more distant from the motherland, right? With allies from the other side of Europe, you have at this point, after centuries, Austria and France allying themselves, for example, against Prussia and Britain. You have also the Russians ever more involved. So you have lots of campaigns again in Germany. You have, and you can clearly see, we've seen it, I think, if you look at the curriculum of Maurice of Saxony that I made a video on last summer, that say important degree of, say, you still find the old sieges in Flanders. There are also still some of the most relevant things that are happening. But you also find French forces as far as Prague. You find, all the most readily self-evident reality of what these armies could do, right? And whenever they had the political and strategical conditions for operating right at this point. And needless to say, in this scenario, maneuver increased much more strategically, also tactically, because if armies were slightly smaller and or better trained and armed, they could just punch more. And so the idea is that it's not much an attritional force. It's also about who brings the best resources. If these theaters are wider, there are more factors interplaying, right? So You see, during Napoleonic Wars, that attritional dimension restarted paradoxically at a tactical level, because everything was much more standardized in a sense. At that level, so everything was more symmetrical with the others, but also at a strategical level, it took yet another proportion. So it's never quite the same. You can't quite generalize that throughout the entire century, for example, there was only this linear tendency. There are some, but with dramatic exceptions that constitute literal eras within the same that are not really quite the same thing. And nobody, by the way, tried at the time to simply categorize this on the basis of this didactic way we have to use today, right? Again, in the Filmkriege series, I talked extensively about the theoretical improvement that was carried out at this point, because there was evidently a need to try to rationalize more what was going on and say to find exactly the best solution in a, say, if not the best solution, say the best theoretical insight to help positively the actual command, which is what at the end of the day all these generals were interested in, also for teaching the new cadres, etc. So that's all something that happened very gradually. But there's this idea that in the Age of Enlightenment, generals fought prevalently to avoid risk and avoiding direct confrontation as long as possible. This is not correct as an idea, because even when warfare was that more attritional and unbalanced and seemingly and seemingly more more stationary, it really still entailed an enormous personal, say, risk in a broader political and strategic sense, and warfare had its own logic by itself, for which you couldn't quite even expect too much from these armies in the first place. But at the same time, whenever you found the conditions of increased quality, of, say, surpassing this inertia for whichever reason we talked about, for example, the Prussian infantry, Reformation, you can say, under Frederick the Great, and you realize even there that it's not that it was those standards came from some sort of strange mathematical equation. They came simply from practice, from expectation, from experience, from insight, from coup d'oeil, prejudices, and so on, right? There were generals, famous ones, successful ones, getting mistaken about the general ideas and sometimes recognizing that and moving the thing for and warfare, because this is what things really go like in military history. There isn't a guy that comes and reforms the army and magically the world changes because of that. Armies already change by themselves, and what you can or can't do is surfing the wave of this change in order to control it better, right? Depending on circumstances that again are not just the army, but why do you have that army that is surely political and social in cause, just as much as, however, the army influences the other two aspects in turn. So it's all that intertwined. By skillfully maneuvering one's forces, one tried to place the adversary in unfavorable position, of course, in which he was no longer sure of being able to maintain communications with the depots and reinforce the garrisons of the fortresses in case of need. Well, this is a proof in itself that was a good reason for trying both whenever the circumstances allow. So it's not just about being shy or not having that much of a sort of drive or capacity. It's just that even a well-conducted campaign could take place without any major field combat, because it was the most strategically sensible thing to do. But of course, the same campaign could also end up in the conquest of large areas from which the enemy was forced to evacuate. So in war, it's always like this, right? There is not a boundary there. Of course, there are some sort of general limitations due to the size of the forces, whatever they can do. But just because you have forces somewhere else, and so it's a much bigger game that, of course, doesn't know any boundary. War is not limited, if not by, of course, physical reality, right? And how much we can go as far as moral forces are involved, which is definitely boundless. And this is often misunderstood about war. There is no such thing like geopolitics. There is not such thing like one factor that basically determines another by the majority of the cases, so you can simply say, well, that's easily how things will go. Nobody can predict the future to a substantial degree of effectiveness. It's just a complete guess that decreases also the likelihood of our foreseeing dramatically just on an everyday basis. So it's you can't quite reason beyond realistically an original scenario behind, say, something that is going to be useful in politics beyond 4 months from the time you're reasoning. Well, there was also another aspect that, of course, was the carnage that warfare was increasingly becoming. Not in the sense that war had not been like that, or that warfare had been allegedly less violent before. This is yet another common mistake. Never think that finding yourself in a World War II shelling is something more traumatizing than, I don't know, a 4th century BC hoplite combat, right? This betrays an unforgivable moral and scientific deficit of analysis of the reality involved. But aside from that, the capacity of concentrating, right, forces was increasing in a given point, right? So, for example, the spread of the flintlock musket and the new field artillery, the battles had been changed significantly by this. More people were getting killed in combat proper than in pursuit. It was the musket that killed more than anything, than cold steel, and only finally artillery. That was technically not even used to kill large amounts of people in the first place. It had mostly psychological importance, like basically all these others, right? That warfare is primarily psychological also as far as weapons are concerned, deterrence, etc. But for example, this meant that even in the pursuit, armies were more sort of capable of maintaining, say, it's not much, of course there could be entire armies collapsing ruinously, but the quotient, the means that would allow you to just send in forces with the gradual uses of reserves, etc., allowed, say, certain battles, even which the loser could claim not just the higher moral ground, but coming home still as an army, right? For example, Malplaquet. The point is that it's the punch, again, the scale of the force that was involved that was ever bigger. So if these armies had not been stopping one another because of the particular European balance, and this was shown with great effect across the world during colonialism, of course, they could take over the literal world in the process. It was normal, just telling you the brutality, of combat here that for a quarter, even a third of the forces involved to be lost in a major battle just through musketry. All right, and the generals faced considerable pressure not to squander armies that had, of course, cost enormous sums just in a single day. Of course, they cost also to be maintained, so this is what forced the general action in general, and why you were fighting that war in the first place. It was evenly bigger than this fear. So it's not even true that Enlightenment warfare was that static. Someone began to theorize that the perfect general was the one who managed to defeat the enemy and force him to surrender exclusively through maneuver, without ever having to run the risks of a major battle. And this was wrong, however. It's something that could remain in theory. A theory that up to this point had never quite existed in the way we intend. Von Clausewitz debunked perfectly this sense that, just through maneuver you can't crush the enemy. But the sense was, in a more secondary insight, that of course it was always possible to make the enemy army collapse in ways that, of course, were essentially reflecting the condition of inferiority in which you could put an army, except that this was becoming de facto ever less likely, because, of course, it was becoming ever more difficult to actually outflank enemy armies, unless you're not invested on another type of, not of army, or say of army, but before that, of state. And this is what was becoming becoming evident, that, of course, the extension of the mobilization, for example, could be rapidly increased to an important degree, which is a bit like the purpose of war ideally, though. So if there was anyone that was starting to scope the various possibilities of war to attack the enemy, but starting to detach oneself, a bit like with the concept of internal lines in Jomini, that eventually, we're talking about 19th century, but recognized that von Clausewitz was right, actually, in the bloodier confrontation and being most strategically sensible, even for the case of the humanitarian purpose. Right? It's better war to be pretty heavy stuff, immediate, because there is a greater chance of an actual resolution than dragging it indefinitely just to hope that your enemy is stupid fundamentally to expose himself to annihilation, right? In a system that is ever more symmetric, by the way, in Europe to that fashion, meaning concretely that yes, everybody would like to bring his own army on the flank of the enemy, and without him even realizing that, and annihilated it. This would happen on some occasions during the 7 Years' War, but even for Frederick II this was exceptional, and most battles were fought in a substantially different way, and even all battles are fought with, every war is fought with that important degree of asymmetrical pursuit, because war is asymmetrical by definition. But again, would the enemy let you do that? Why would you be that smart and the enemy not? Right? It was rather a matter of, again, of state building, and again, this is what would be fully accomplished by the Napoleonic armies. There was an evidence that, for example, firepower was ever more crushing, and that so this perennial frontal confrontation could simply be solved more effectively through frontal attack, which is always true throughout any era, telling you true. Even World War I. This is what, again, people get wrong all the time, that it was the best way to fight war. It wasn't stupid to launch continuous offensive against the enemy to actually bring the thing to an end early, and with a decisive result, right? So if people do not understand that, if they think literally that machine guns stop infantry attacks, and of course this would never explain why, in this great offensive both sides lost hundreds of thousands of men, and that obviously has a massive cost, even if you manage not to break through, for those who defend, right? You can't understand war in the first place. And so warfare always is, at the end of the day, about also this tendency towards symmetry, because that's what you're tending to compensate when the enemy attacks you. Just warfare in this sense was accelerating as much as politics, as society, right? The world was modernizing itself ever faster during the Industrial Revolution, etc. So this is if you had to put together for the first time in history with that speed an unprecedented amount of forces. And this unhinged the entire political and social system that required that ever larger masses to be fielded accordingly, right? And of course, even regarding the aforementioned statement that warfare could just be about outflanking, this remained confined to, say, a general ideal, general notionism. We don't have to think that the same generals who wrote this actually would fight or could fight, because that in order just to pursue that, because simply the conditions would not allow you to do so. And not just the most daring generals were aware thus of the limits of this approach. It is no coincidence that the most famous commanders of the time, from the French Marshal Turenne to the Duke of Marlborough, stated that a decisive battle, of course, is more advantageous than many sieges, and that, say, we should bring the war to an enemy country without being obsessed with the capture of the fortresses just per se, which actually, these are early thinkers for today's chronology, right? And that happened in a time in which fortresses were actually that strategically important that you couldn't quite ignore, but they understood that it was something, of course, moral in the dimension. It's not the static, material, unmovable fortress that makes any of its effectiveness. It's still the troops, it's still the, say, who sends them there and commands them how, which purpose, etc. That's what makes real strategy. And so major confrontations are always more preferable, unless you're buying time for some other reason, which is the other point, right? One thing is reasoning in a merely military sense, which conceptually must be taught to be a real thing. But another thing is also realizing that, again, war is just an instrument of politics with other means, and so you can't quite simply unseat that generals were politicians, and so they had every different reason for mitigating their own military performance, and so affecting the war in many different ways, because even a single campaign, a single battle is part, of course, of the bigger picture. And Turenne, Marlborough reasoned by thinking essentially once the enemy army was defeated in open field, even the strongholds would still fall on their own, like just we explained, and therefore seeking the decisive battle was the safest and most economical way to resolve a campaign. Everybody who has studied von Clausewitz knows that at the beginning of the Frauenkriege, he says clearly, like, the most never listen to people who have humanitarian concerns, because these are the people who actually make more innocents die, right? And he explains eventually, of course, why that's the case, but it's what we're illustrating in this very case. Few generals were willing to fully run the risks implicit in this philosophy, though, because that requires just a greater mind, just like all the great generals must have if they want to succeed, because everything, again, is incredibly risky, and there is an establishment, again, in Europe, this is the reflection of politics and society, that doesn't quite challenge that has not just enemies in other countries, as we're thinking this mostly on the wake of the nation state or the post-Westphalian world that we would allegedly live in or have ever lived in, that there are other enemies within the state, right? The reason why you're a general and you're fighting the war is not necessarily because you hate the guys from the other side. Actually, there was a lot of gallantry involved, a lot of chivalry, among the elite and so on, because of course it was much more important to attain, for example, power at home as an ancien regime rather than just annihilating that state out there. And maybe some other country taking advantage of that. And let's say nobody really needs to make a much greater mess than the one that the conflict rendered necessary, right? Because you must analyze the reasons why every war was fought, which is not, it's not the absolute military principle that von Clausewitz teaches us being always mitigated by the political one. But there were certain circumstances in which this could, of course, be enhanced again by, in fact, particular political situations. For example, the wars of King Frederick the Great of Prussia, who was literally a soldier king, and who thus did not have to respond to any ministry or war council, for example, for decisive battles to become more frequent and full-blown sieges rarer. I mean, Frederick the Great risked a good three. I say he always risked that, but there were three occasions in which he effectively fought to lose and to lose the entire country. And still, the miracles of the House of Brandenburg, as they were called, that are political ones, not military ones, brought him still to not just maintain his throne, but eventually to succeed. And by the way, one of the few leaders that had this military curriculum who eventually lived for decades in peace and keeping to administrate the country. This is, I think, a very beautiful idea. For example, Louis XIV wasn't really a soldier. He didn't have any genius. He was great in everything else militarily concerned. He literally created the French army that was that impressive apparatus, to say the least. But he had to pay a very heavy cost for his wars on the long run. And so even personally, even just from a broader sense, you can argue that the French Revolution was seeded in that enormous cost that France had been paying just for, say, actually obtaining some result. But again, what's the cost of that? So it's it all depends always, and that's why I like this sort of basic videos, because they make you see the thing from a broader perspective, not just a single story that we will have to tell, but that these videos are sort of propedeutic for too. Now, most of those generals directing military operations clung to some ideas that we, for some reason, thought to be outdated, academic, and so that there was some sort of, especially with the French Revolution, thing that they wouldn't see coming, in a way. This could be true only to the extent, as explained in my video about the French nobility and bourgeoisie, as far as the French royal army during the 18th century was concerned. That is to say that generals became ever more political figures, and warfare was run actually by this sort of small, say, lower aristocrats that were truly the backbone and the soul of that brutally and traumatically higher standard French military culture that the same French Revolutionary Army actually owed much from the monarchic era. Also because essentially the royal army kept being the French army after the revolution. So in practice they were the same thing, but plus of course all the new records, etc. Lots of stuff changed. But what I mean is that the flourishing, for example, of treatises and the fact that these were not until von Clausewitz of any specific scientific, say, of complete scientific validity, as von Clausewitz, that makes sort of little history of this production exposes, doesn't mean, even historically, that, and other than just militarily, that of course things were that way. Right? The fact that you have these treatises doesn't mean that generals, and the many generals also who didn't write for that matter about these issues, were actually following that. right? But not even the same people who said this, again, were necessarily fighting that way in practice. Because those theories were not meant to be what we think they are, that is to say, an absolutely and accurately scientific explanation of what war was at the time. We must understand why they were written as pieces of literature in the first place, and then understanding that they had a few to do with a war. And even if there had been this sort of caution, it doesn't mean that, again, war wouldn't obviously spur you to do something substantially different. So I disagree with that, because it seems to me that, for example, still today there's a very academic vision on warfare, sometimes even by saying military, but it doesn't mean that the military is not competent, actually, when it gets down to do certain things. And there are some civilizational problems. The military mostly learns some sort of modules that are, operationally based. And then, of course, the problem of strategy is that you must learn how to fight a war to understand how that system really works. And it's not that easy, right? It's especially evident to me that warfare has remained the same, telling the truth, but its civilization has sort of become more dull and less responsible and competent. And since we live in a much bigger system today, it's much easier to find asymmetry, not meant as guerrilla force, but the actual meaning of asymmetry in warfare, between definitely the expectation and the reality as well. So I should make many other videos to explain fully what I mean here, but the concept being that, again, when I studied medieval warfare, I don't see major disasters happening. At least when you, even in great defeats, you realize that the command was actually doing what needed to be done. As much as the armies were fundamentally okay, there was also much less asymmetry. Today, it seems that disasters are a bit bigger in relative terms, too, because they are essentially, say, the fruit of a much more evident incompetence that corresponds to whether that particular commander doesn't know what he's doing, or mostly just first of all, it's a political problem, right? Again, there are examples that I will not descend on, but the habituation to warfare is also risky, just per se, in the eventuality of having to fight a war when you wouldn't like to. Now, the fate of the English General Cornwallis, who during the War of the American Independence locked himself up with his army in the fortress of Yorktown and was forced to capitulate after a long American-French siege, is usually seen as, look, this is a clue of one of the clues how to remain anchored to a vision of war dominated by depots and strongholds that were now proving counterproductive. It is true that even there was some sort of limit, right, in vision rather than in actual practice. But again, I made a video about the American War of Independence, and that explains fundamentally what that sort of picture was about. It's first a political problem rather than a sort of military competent one. Then, of course, in Napoleonic times, there would be a massive wake-up call that definitely forced, even if you look at my avatar, a reflection that a much needed reflection that, however, was also just, as much as the Napoleonic armies, the just the obvious consequence of this gradual development, right? And so that doesn't matter how traumatic it was in, say, the spread of the revolution, of the, of all the circumstances that led to these wars, to the way armies change, etc. That it's still part of the same. Okay, we have to beat the enemy, even as a society, in order to be fundamentally able to win, for whichever reason is motivating us. So this is, again, a substantially valid say topic to discuss every time, because I think most of our problems derive from the misunderstanding of such dynamics, and they're not immediately evident, right? Again, but when you study warfare, I think they emerge so self-evidently and it's a bit difficult to ignore them altogether, and so you can easily understand who really passed through these issues or not, because warfare is not what say the media habituated us to see, or the media in general, right? Not necessarily the conspiracy theory about the media, but of course us as consumers of the same. And so look at all these channels on YouTube that tell you, look, I make a video about this this campaign, this battle, and you understand that the only, say, the debate there is mostly the national card. Look, I make a video about this country, so every undereducated moron can connect and say, look, it's talking about my country, so it means it's my team, it's cool. But of course there is no explanation whatsoever of these strategic and tactical implications, and the in 12 minutes you're not going to make that person more knowledgeable. In the case he was stimulated to learn more, right? You need to make a real effort to pick every single source available on a battle, on a campaign, and studying that for a lifetime. With honesty, with sense of purpose and completion, etc. And it's difficult, right? Because you need, first of all, the motivation, you need the method, you need the background, you need the sort of like the entire picture that is quite often not really a thing, right? This entire culture, subculture revolving around warfare online is just, let's tell a story and let's skip it, the entire necessary to actually understand the issue. This is valid for any subject, but war seems to be the one suffering the most from this proportion. Well, in any case, this was it. We will talk naturally more about modern warfare, 18th century warfare, and more. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.